What is your real reason? Is it Jesus? Written by James Edward Curtis Jr. Speech by James Edward Curtis Jr. Inspired by the Holy Ghost and the mercy and grace of Jesus. Relief from suffering by means of the birth of Jesus. Matthew 1:18 through 24 describes the birth of Jesus. They will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Luke 2:1 through 7 describes the location of the birth of Jesus. They placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Luke 2:8 through 19 describes the angels which appeared before the shepherds regarding the birth of Jesus. And Luke 2:20 describes the response of the shepherds. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things they had heard and seen. The shepherds responded this way because Jesus paid the price for those in suffering. I, James Edward Curtis Jr., once wrote a draft of a dissertation concerning suffering, which the Bible suggests Jesus intended to save us from. Suffering in the form of inequality. For instance, inequality between many white Americans and many black Americans. Or dare I suggest, inequality among the supposed suffering. Inequality among black Americans. Suffering in the form of inequality and the domination of unexplained differences and unequal outcomes. Some of my 2002 dissertation draft reads, researchers have a long-standing interest in understanding the causes and consequences of inequality. One approach to analyzing inequality is to compare average economic choices from a classical theoretical framework. Another approach considers the impact of the formation of society through statutes and institutions on average economic outcomes. This dissertation studies the effects of both. By investigating the effects of slavery on white-black wealth inequality upon the emancipation of slaves in the United States of America using historical data. Foremost, a theory of relative wealth is presented, where wealth is determined by group-specific salaries, hours of work, consumption, and interest rates. Historical white-black differences in wealth were estimated using decomposition. This technique decomposes economic differences into the explained portion of white-black wealth differences explained by differences in classical characteristics and the unexplained portion due to different returns to classical characteristics. Results confirm that we cannot reject the claim when comparing the wealth of ex-slaves to the wealth of whites. The portion of differences in wealth which were unexplained dominate the portion of differences in wealth due to different classical characteristics. Suffering in the form of inequality and linking modern differences to historical roots. Preliminary results from my 2002 dissertation draft also suggest the size and source of contemporary white-black wealth differences have historical roots. In 1870, at least 75% of white-black wealth differences were not explained by characteristic differences described by the classical model when employing the primary index. This is consistent with wealth decomposition of the late 20th century data that shows that 3/4 of white-black wealth differences were unexplained by classical characteristic differences. Suffering in the form of inequality, as represented by a negative correlation between time of the real end of enslavement and the magnitude of unexplained differences. Finally, preliminary results from my 2002 dissertation draft also suggest unexplained differences in white-black wealth in states which ended slavery as a result of the Civil War were 10% higher than unexplained effects in states which ended slavery well before the Civil War. Combining this 10% gap with persistent magnitudes of the unexplained effects in white-black wealth differences, we cannot reject the existence of a negatively bounded correlation between the duration of time from enslavement and the magnitude of unexplained differences in white-black wealth. In other words, for those who monitor relative wealth accumulation and are unmoved by divine empathy, a disincentive to increase the rate of full manumission is possible. Consider slavery as overt formal constraints to zero or even negative wealth accumulation. And consider freedom of ex-slaves as the perception of overt lack of formal wealth constraints, and yet the possibility of covert, hidden, and informal constrained wealth accumulation controls, i.e. Jim Crow laws. And finally, consider full manumission as the uninhibited opportunity to accumulate wealth at rates of entities without a history of slavery or with a more limited history of slavery. This definition of full manumission probably includes the necessity of wealth transfers to fully manumitted ex-slaves and transition from slavery or free ex-slave to full manumission. Nevertheless, this negatively bounded correlation between duration of time from the end of enslavement and magnitude of unexplained differences in wealth suggests the magnitude in the unexplained portion of white-black wealth differences increases as the length of time from the real end of enslavement decreases. This poses another research question. What is the level and source of wealth accumulation differences among blacks with a long history of freedom or manumission and blacks with a short history of freedom or manumission? This investigation probably starts with the re-examination of the historical documentation of the former existence of free black slave owners of black slaves. However, Jesus saves. Why do I say all of this? Why describe relief from suffering by means of the birth of Jesus? Why mention suffering in the form of inequality and the domination of unexplained differences in unequal outcomes? Why mention suffering in the form of inequality and linking modern differences to historical roots? Why mention suffering in the form of inequality as represented by a negative correlation between time of the real end of enslavement and the magnitude of unexplained differences? Because Jesus was born to save the whites. Jesus was born to save the blacks. Jesus was born to save the light-skinned black. Jesus was born to save the dark-skinned black. Jesus was born to save the men. Jesus was born to save the women. Jesus was born to save the poor. Jesus was born to save the rich. Jesus was born to save the faithless. Jesus was born to save the faithful. There is not a friend like Jesus. No, not one. What is your real reason? Is it Jesus? Written by James Edward Curtis Jr. Speech by James Edward Curtis Jr. Inspired by the Holy Ghost.